loud. All right, so welcome to this lecture. It is about framework when going for critique against plans. Often you will hear about framework arguments in the context of going for framework against planless affirmatives. This is kind of the opposite. There's a lot of ways to think about this, but the first, I think, requires us to ask the question, what is a criticism? Critique is a framework argument. It is asking the question, what can we do to think about the world differently? What is the aesthetic quality of the 1AC? What is its philosophical underpinning? What informs the 1AC's ethic? How does the affirmative know the things that it claims to know? How does it relate to who we are as people, what we're doing here, what the point of debate is, etc. All of these are essentially making a set of arguments that are often thought of in terms of links or impacts or alternatives that basically all amount to one thing, which is the thing that the 1AC has done. The questions that it is asked are the wrong questions. It has done the wrong thing. And the format of the debate ought to be different to reflect an interrogation of the world that lets us kind of see beyond just the 1AC's textual presentation. Critiques are aesthetic, they're like art, they're like music, they're poetry, and kind of whatever it is you are interested in or intrigued by, or how you want to think about the world differently than how you're told. Debate allows you to do this in a way that no other activity does, because a lot of the things that might interest you or that you really care about aren't things that you could talk about to a teacher in a history classroom or at a math lecture or in a government class. But you can do that in debate. And the reason for that is that people have to listen to you, because if they don't answer your arguments, then they lose. So there's a competitive incentive for them to care about what you have to say. Your judges are often people with master's degrees or PhDs, or even if they're not, they're people who have read a lot, thought about the world, thought about their place in the world, and thought about debate as a set of arguments that is not necessarily a search for the truth, but is ultimately something more than that, something that encompasses a set of interactions between people, that it's a sort of community that exists both broadly in terms of the fact we're all here spending our summer in Hanover instead of the beach or Disney World or wherever else you would be. And the question I think that the critique lets us ask is why are we so invested in this thing called debate? Why is this game so meaningful and valuable to us? And what can we get out of it that is more than just, is the plan a good idea or a bad idea? So the first kind of arguments that I'm interested in exploring is one that has to do with a combination of rhetoric and philosophy. I don't really expect that many of us have read a lot of rhetorical studies literature or psychoanalysis literature, so I will avoid using buzzwords as much as I possibly can. I think that when you're going for framework against a policy team, you will benefit tremendously from avoiding the use of so-called buzzwords whenever possible. They're irritating, they lower your speaker points. They are often a substitute for substantive engagement with the 1AC. But the first thing I want to talk about is the register of prescription versus description. 5 or 6 years ago, I was sitting in Zilker Park reading Red, White, and Black for the first time. And something that kind of struck me was the way that the author of that book talks about how something we can learn from rhetoric and Lacan and some other people is that the way that we think about the world or the way that we talk about the world often comes down to two different registers. The first is the one that we traditionally think of when we think of a policy plan and affirmative as the register of prescriptions. What should we do? The world has a lot of things going on that might, be thought of as violent or sad or terrible. There's nuclear wars and asteroid collisions and climate change and cyber attacks and OCOs and whatever else. All of these require a prescriptive engagement, a normative instantiation of an idea for what we should do about them, which is the plan text. The plan text imagines an agent taking action. The 1AC prescribes a solution to a set of harms that it has imagined happen. Does this sound familiar, right? Yeah. The second is the register of description, which is less concerned about what exactly we should do, because ultimately we don't really know. We don't really have agency over government action. Many of us are not stakeholders who really feel as if we have the ability to affect broad macro political change. And if we did, we might disagree with the premise entirely. You might think that the federal government is a beacon of imperialism or is genocidal or whatever it is your sort of criticism issue with state-based engagement and state-based prescriptions might be. And instead, you might want to ask the question, how do we describe the world in a way that is more meaningful or results in more engagement or can make us more ethical? And so most critiques, most framework arguments say that instead of thinking about the 1AC as a set of imagined fictitious scenarios, which may or may not be true, a hypothetical prescription that may or may not happen, and then sort of assume that the plan occurs through fiats, and then debate about those hypothetical consequences. Instead, we should think of the 1AC as a rhetorical artifact, an object of study, a research paper, a set of ideas. And the more useful form of engagement is not to assume the premise that the federal government will take action to resolve a harm, but instead to question the knowledge of the 1AC. Why do they think that an OCO attack is going to happen? Why do they think that we should be scared of Russia? What is it about China that is particularly threatening? Why should we approach climate change via an apocalyptic lens? What does it mean to be human? All of these sorts of questions are sidestepped by the affirmatives framework argument because they want to skip to the end. They want to say how we got to the place we are is much less important than getting there. The negative instead says that what matters is not the end result, the sort of destination of the 1AC, which is the plan text, but instead the journey. So ask yourself, what goes into the research process? What sort of drives debaters to want to imagine the worst case scenarios if you're reading the security K, for example? What sets of search terms do lab leaders tell students to use to find articles that describe Xi as dangerous or threatening? What books do we read or what journals do we focus on when finding arguments about why terrorists are threatening? And how might we intervene in that process in a way that makes our approach to research, our approach to how we relate to and understand the world more ethical, and therefore the debate community generally more ethical? I think framework is important because it more broadly asks the question, what is the point of debate? Why are we here? Perhaps it's just competition, but there are lots of games with winners and losers. That's not unique to debate. A lot of people will say that it's the amount of things that you learn. But if the affirmatives model of debate creates a competitive incentive to learn things about the world that are violent or cruel, then why bother? Why bother to engage in a set of structures that you think is bad or unethical? What's the point of imagining the actions of a government you think is tyrannical, assuming that's part of your position? To say that all of these could be true, that it could be true that the federal government is built on genocide and slavery, it could be true that the 1AC's understanding of terrorism is racist, it could be true that the way that we think about securing cyberspace relies on a concept of a Western frontier that reflects colonial relationships between us and them, that incentivizes us to think of people who look different than us as our enemies. All that can be true, but we should still evaluate the plan, right? We should still imagine the hypothetical consequences of the 1AC and weigh it against the criticism. I think this form of compartmentalization is a great place to start when thinking about your offense against framework. What kind of person do you become? What kind of person does it train you to be when you could simultaneously acknowledge that the negatives links are true? Because your lab leaders have probably already told you this, but most of the time the neg wins a link to the K, right? It's like very hard for most policy apps to dispute the premise of a link argument. So what does it tell you when someone says, it might be true that the negative wins a link argument, that the narration or storytelling or ideology of the 1AC is racist, but it doesn't matter because the hypothetical implementation of that plan solves an impact. So that outweighs, and who cares? And I'm kind of curious what your thoughts are. What do we think that model of thinking, that form of compartmentalizing description and prescription, action and consequences from ethics, what kind of people does it tell us we should be in the world, whether we're in academia or via our relationships or in policy? Yeah, what do you think?
One, it's kind of really difficult when I first started policy. It's kind of really difficult to put myself into a position where I think as that person, then I don't really like to teach. Because there might be a time where they might throw either a Black genocide, or when it comes to racism, now I have to be that racist person to say that don't really matter right now besides quality. So it really affects the way I think. Like, I know it's not who I am personally, but it makes you really think about, like, is it really necessary for me to think this way when responding to arguments where they say we need to put this first because Black people are important, yet me saying, okay, we could do that later, but right now, NATO's doing this, the government is doing that. So yeah, it just really affects how I really perceive.
Does anyone else feel similarly when they're defending a plan? It sort of results in you making arguments that you personally disagree with in a way that is discomforting? I admitted. Oops. Thank you for pointing that out. I wasn't paying attention. Yeah, what do you think?
I think even when, like, on the next side, like, if you were to argue a more policy-oriented strategy, like, a lot of the scenarios for DAs are, like, very problematic. It's like, the DAs this year are like, we need to help the Republicans win because if you don't, like, nuclear war, collapse. And it's like, I mean, the Republicans have never been good, but like at a time where they're calling like queer trans people groomers and like ramping up their just sort of genocidal rhetoric, I think it's pretty morally disgusting to advocate that Republicans should win. I would never feel comfortable with that.
Okay, so could you think that in terms of translating this into an argument that we can make, if we're going for a criticism against an app, when they say that the most important thing about debate, the thing that makes it different from other activities, is clash and the ability to debate a well-prepared opponent, and the maximization of that clash is what maximizes debate's skills. Could we maybe say that the idea of clash for clash's sake creates this sort of perverse incentive to read arguments that are morally repugnant because they happen to have the best evidence or like the most cards and clash best with the 1AC? Yeah, so I think that's like a good place to start when thinking about what happens when we think of debate as a means to an end, where we view ourselves as basically, investments, and debate sort of, we're investing in our own skill set, and the end result of that system the end result of that investing is we come out of debate smarter, faster, better decision maker, better at research, etc. But the question is, like, what kind of research are we good at? When in real life, we're deciding what job to take, and we want to live in Washington, D.C., just as a hypothetical example. There's tons of different think tanks you might be able to get a job at. There's lots of different people in Congress you could be a staffer for. And if we think that the point of life is maximizing our skill set, then working for a think tank that specializes in, like a thing that we find unethical, but seems to be accomplishing more, versus working for a socialist organization, you would always pick the former if we went by the way that debate trains us, at least in this kind of view of debate that I'm casting, which I think people might disagree with, for sure. But I think that if we're NAG, we sort of want to cast a wide net about the type of people that policy debate teaches us to be. Yeah, Armand, what do you think?
It's like fully applicable to debate is like people like invest in critical debate as a means to an end, like most of the time.
In the sense of, like, people will read the CAP-K for 4 years and then join an investment bank, or like, what do you mean by that?
That, but like, debating the point is so like, do you think it's like kind of disingenuous to make this argument a lot of times?
What do you mean by disingenuous? So I think that it is true that the choices people make are strategic ones. Competitive incentives overwhelmingly influence the decisions people make in their debates. I think that is true. Why do you think that reading a critique is disingenuous if it is both for social ethical reasons and also competitive reasons? Like,
Yeah,
why can't it
so
be both of those?
I wouldn't see it as disingenuous if A was like the policy debate is disingenuous because they're allowed to make a lot of arguments, some of them, which they may not exactly agree with, but like for the K debater who reads the same kind of strategic argument and then is also like staunchly either so like, for example, the like managerial okay on the water topic. Like, do I believe that like humans like should not be managing water at all? Like, obviously not, because that would result in a world where like people, like a lot of people would not have water. But like also, do I believe that like Republicans should win the midterms? Like, no, of course not.
So there can be something in between. We can kind of modulate our argumentative choices away from extremes, is what you're saying?
I guess so. I understand the point you're making, but I just think it like applies equally to like critical thinking as well.
Okay, great. Who disagrees with this? And more importantly, does this matter? Is this argument responsive if the app says it?
Probably not, because the app hasn't made like a criticism of the critique. Like,
Well, let's take a step back. So basically, I've given a debate shaped subjectivity. Subject formation outweighs because the plan is fake, but who we become as people is real. The cumulative buildup of believing that saying things on the 1AC that are racist, and going for case outweighs affects who we become as people at the end of our careers. That's that's 2NC argument 1. 1AR, your response is this links to both sides, question mark? How would you kind of like format this in a thing you could say in the 1AR to answer 2NC number 1 on framework?
I guess that would be the problem, right? You have to find the reason why the critique. So, okay, if I had like an argument, which, I hope if I'm in a good position to explain I would, where I would be like, the critique is like, will lead us to ends that are not necessarily something that we want, So like for the managerials, do we really not want people to have like reliable access to water? Like, it is like the case that the critique subjectivities and the way that the critique teaches us about certain topics will not necessarily result in the most optimal outcomes.
Great.
Okay?
I'll pause you here. The 2NR should take advantage of this 1AR mistake and win the debate. What is the error that's happening? Ichi, yeah. Yeah. This argument concedes the debate does in fact shape subjectivity, which is very good for the net. Now, like, you could still win K equal bad. The way that it shapes subjectivity is worse than the way that the F shapes subjectivity. Totally possible for the 2AR to win this debate. But the way that you structure your 2NC is tremendously impactful. And thinking about your word choice, your syntax, your structure can bait 1AR responses that result in a crush for the neg. Because if you say debate shapes subjectivity, we spend a lot of time on the activity, it determines what kind of people we become. When doing policy research is bad because it makes us believe that the only thing that matters is the biggest possible impact instead of the thing that impacts our lives. The cumulative buildup of thinking extinction outweighs racism makes us bad people and decision makers. The 1AR will like know what to say. They'll like get their debate shape subjectivity block. They'll talk about how like that their church matters more to who they are as a person, which is a lie probably. And say extinction outweighs or something. However, if we structure the 2NC where we kind of pose this exact same argument, but with different language to kind of disguise it slightly, can often bait a 1AR that concedes the premise of the argument that we're going for. And so when you're writing your 2NC for framework on the critique, thinking of ways to make the same argument, but remove the buzzwords, remove the thing that is in the AFS AT this header. So the neg loses framework debates all the time because the 1AR has a series of headers that respond to various key buzzwords that the 2NC says. When you say those buzzwords, their arguments will be responsive because they'll put them in the 1AR. Instead, a 2NC should do a combination of the two. You should have your real offensive arguments be labeled something that is not typical of framework debates, something kind of new, something specific to your criticism instead of generalizable, something that comes from 1NC evidence, ideally a quote from your 1NC evidence, and then compares your 1NC evidence to 2AC evidence that they've read in response. And so you're essentially embedding your framework offense on the line by line as you're going through the 2NC. And then maybe if you want to, if there's an argument that you're not going for, but they have an answer to and will spend time answering, then you put like a 1-sentence thing there. So let's say, who knows the like distancing DA argument? I think this argument's like not that bad. Yeah, Michi, what is it? Mm-hmm. Yeah, right. Perfect. So in here versus out there, you should care about things in debate more so than things outside of debate, because you have the capability as a critic to influence what debaters do in rounds. You do not have the ability to influence what bills Nancy and Mitch or all our other friends in the Senate are going to pass. I think this argument's pretty good, but let's say you're definitely not going for it and you're debating a team who kind of is on top of their stuff. You might just say distancing DA, explain it for a sentence or two. Then the 1AR is going to like spend a bunch of time answering it, and you never cared anyways. Your real offensive argument is this argument about white epistemology from a piece of 1NC evidence that you have described in detail by using the language that your 1AC author uses, and you've described it as a link argument. That's the 2NR. And the 1AR is not going to answer it correctly because they don't know what it is. But you've described it without using buzzwords, by using the language of your evidence. There's a piece of evidence that your judge can call for. And that is, I think, a much better version of a 2NC on framework than the one that people typically do, both for intellectual reasons and strategy reasons. Okay, so the rest of this, I've got some cards, and we're going to go through them. Now, something important, I don't think cards are necessary on framework. I think for some judges they are, and they're very helpful. I think that the mistake people make in framework debates is that they think that they need to find evidence that is specifically a framework card. And the reason why judges who say never go for a framework with a K, the reason they say this is because they think of framework as the separate thing. They put it on a different sheet. It feels like cheating. It feels like a way of circumventing clash. It is the opposite. It is your link argument. It is your impact argument. It is your alternative. All of it is there. The way that you do impact framing occurs via the framework debate. The way that you link to the plan and the form of the plan and the way that the plan thinks about the world is done via framework debating. Your alternative is your framework interpretation. It is a different way of relating to debate and thinking about debate mediated through whatever your alternative evidence says. And that will sort of demonstrate to the judge that framework isn't this separate thing that is just meant to circumvent clash, but is clashing with every single thing that the 2AC has said. And if the 1AR fails to address it adequately, the debate is over. My sort of pitch for thinking about the critique this way is that it allows you to construct a file that is modular and difficult for the 1AR to answer. So there's a thing in debate called a satellite critique, which just means an offshoot criticism that may be different from your main 1NC argument that you read in the block, or you read on case in the 1NR or 1NC. It has to do with your K, but it's not the same. These are not very useful on their own because they don't have uniqueness for them. There's no alternative that explicitly solves them. But if you think of critique debate instead as a framework argument, as sort of framework plus link, where the link is embedded in your framework argument, then this kind of modular case style where you have a China module, a Russia module, an OCO module, an AI module, a scenario planning module, the block can then kind of proliferate different critiques in it, each with an independent link turns case and connection to your framework argument that forces the 1AR to address all of these with equal time and veracity, because they're all threats, because the 2NR can be framework plus a link, and it can be any of the links that you've extended in the block, whether they are part of your main critique or part of a different critique. And that allows you to kind of scaffold your file construction in a way that is much more useful than I think a lot of files are. So yeah, let me. We have 20 minutes or 30 minutes? 30? Okay, great. Okay, so just to give you an idea of like file construction, this is what the kind of IRK that we read at the NDT looked like. So there's like some different 1NCs, and then we have kind of a framework thing. Answers to authors, and then links. The links are all basically different modules. So each one of these link arguments and these things could all be a kind of a net benefit to our interpretation. So instead of thinking of our framework interpretation as the separate thing that is kind of isometric and different from everything else, it is a broad interpretation that speaks to what the negative's role is. So typically framework debates, neg has the burden of rejoinder. Your counter interpretation should define what constitutes a burden of rejoinder. In this case, we've explicitly said what the negative should be doing. What is their role? Disproving the 1AC constitutes the following. And it could be any number of things. It could be based on your critique. It could be based on what you want to get out of debate, what you think debate should look like, but you should always define what the role of the negative is, what role of the affirmative is, because otherwise you get these RFDs that are like, I thought the framework debate was a wash because no one explained to me why it mattered if you won your framework argument. Both the affirmative and negative are guilty of this. And the way to circumvent this is by clearly establishing what the burden of rejoinder is under your framework argument and what is the burden of proof under your framework argument. You know, and then we've got, why is my laptop's frozen? So that's glorious. No, I guess I should do that. I'm so sorry, Ria. Share screen. Yeah, I know where the share screen is. I'm just trying to figure out what I should share. I'm just gonna share, I guess I'll share this for now. It's still frozen though. Whatever, it doesn't matter. I'll share something different. Oh. Yeah, it's like Word is frozen. Oh. Yeah, this is devastating. Yeah, this is actually a Virelio lecture. Okay, well, I guess I could, oh, there we go. There we go. It's not responding. That's a good sign. It'll restart now. It'll get happy again at some point. All right, well, while we're waiting for this nonsense, does anyone have questions about kind of part one, the me talking portion? Part two will be the you talking portion, which I'm looking forward to, but anyone have questions? Yeah. Great question. So in my mind, there's two answers to this. The first answer is the whole 2NC is framework, because critiques are framework arguments. They ask the question, how can we think about the world in a way that is different from the way the 1AC thought about the world, which to me is a question of framework, because it also instructs your critic that they should think about the world in a way different than the 1AC has taught you to think about it, which is always a framework argument. In terms of what the 2AC answering 2AC1 framework, we could weigh the aff against the consequences. It depends on what type of critique you're reading. So critiques that have impacts that are about the 1AC scholarship, you should spend a significant amount of time on framework, but that time should be spent doing link debating and impact debating under the guise of disads to their model, where you describe your link arguments as DAs to their model. The reason for this is that their model of debate basically says that the scholastic dispute you have with the 1AC isn't relevant because the implementation of the plan will obviously always outweigh whatever that dispute is. So if the 1AC reads a piece of evidence you think is racist, their reading of that card is like obviously not worse than extinction. You can say that it is, But it's like not. It's like clearly everyone on the planet dying a fiery death in a nuclear tornado is worse than, you know, your opponents have read a card that talks about Xi Jinping in a way that's colonial, right? Just like factually that is true. But, you know, their model of debate means, therefore, that there's sort of no competitive incentive or reason to ever make arguments that are about the 1AC scholarship. So you can frame your link arguments as disads to their model. Something to be wary of, if your link arguments are to the consequences of the act. So OCO attribution is bad because attribution results in the naming and shaming of countries in Africa, which then results in being a justification for wars against them, is an example of a link argument that has consequence. Those type of link arguments and impact arguments rely less on framework, because rather than having your win condition be that the affirmative should not get to weigh the consequences of the plan, your win condition is the consequences of that plan are bad. And so your framework argument becomes much less about winning that the 1AC shouldn't get to weigh their plan against the critique, and much more purely an impact framing argument, right? That the consequences of imperialism, which are much more likely than the consequences the 1AC avoids, should matter more to you in terms of the way that you think about impact assessment. But to both say the consequence of the plan are bad because it results in naming and shaming African countries and wars against them, and don't weigh those consequences, doesn't really make sense as a coherent story. So does that answer your question a bit? Okay. Anyone else? Yeah. What is your question? You've said.
So like, can you give a few examples of different things that not necessarily like burden your mouth, but like a burden to impact, like the least of their impact?
Oh, like links to the consequences of the plan via the security K? Well, so the security K is typically a critique of the representations of the 1AC. So the way that I would think of the security K is just a framework argument. That is all the security K is doing. It is saying that the way that the 1AC thinks of and conceives of the world is bad, and we should conceive and think of it as differently. Otherwise, there are both material and immaterial consequences. The reason that is a framework argument is because it is a question of how do we know what we know? How do we know that Russia's a threat? How do we know that, you know, OCO is dangerous? How do we know that attribution is good, etc.? And so your 2NC should feature a set of link arguments that are about the way the 1AC thinks about the world, and say that that thinking results in bad policies and bad outcomes. Yeah.
So like for different judges, like some judges are a bit more framework, others like
Mhm.
paradigm statements, like framework into the framework.
Yeah.
Like how do you shift your thinking based
Well,
on-
I'm advocating they're the same thing.
Okay, but, like,
So-
maybe the perception of those judges who, like, don't necessarily want to see a framework fit, like, what would you do?
Well, so a couple things. One, I would go for a counter plan and a DA, or like T, or like anything else. Second, if you do have those judges, you want to go for the critique. You can do this literal exact same thing, but just call it link. Like you could just be like, 2AC1 framework, spend like 20 seconds on it, then say 2AC2, they say permutation. I'll do the link debating here. And then you do this exact same thing where you talk about the way that we think about debate, the sort of like role of the activity, the purpose of their scholarship, the consequences of their scholarship, why the consequence of their scholarship results in bad subject formation, and why that is more important than the 1AC via link and impact calculus. I'm saying it makes sense to call them a framework argument because that's what they are. But some people hear the word framework and they're like, that sounds like cheating. And so they don't want it to be described to them as a framework argument. They want to say, I voted nag on the link outweighs and turns the case, and the alternative provides uniqueness for it. They don't want to say, I voted nag on framework argument. I don't think that the app gets to weigh the plan. So it is judge dependent, but it is not a content question. It is purely a labeling question. And so I would say you should make the exact same set of arguments and label them something different. Okay, any other questions? Yeah. Then the app should not get to the way like the advantages of the plan native is like that scholarship, and then the 2 and I could just be all in on. So maybe I think that if you're making an argument about the way that capitalism influences how we think about the world, that makes sense to me. I think that the 2 and R is then essentially just like a diss ad where you read a bunch of, where you extend a bunch of cards that say cap is bad, and framework is slightly less important. Something to note is that criticisms whose implications are about the 1AC scholarship and its effect on who we become as people heavily require framework arguments. Criticisms that say the consequences of the plan cause extinction because they perpetuate capital require a little bit less emphasis on framework because you don't need framework as much in order to outweigh the case, because you also have a very large impact, and those debates are usually adjudicated on a combination of evidence quality and execution of the extensions of that evidence. You could use a framework argument to get rid of a permutation. So 1NC says cap K, 2AC says permutation, do both. It's a double bind, either the links are small and the alternative can overcome them, or they're gigantic, or either the alternative can't do anything and can't overcome the links, or the alternative solves all the links, in which case it also solves the app, because most links for the cap K are much larger than the 1AC. So you could use a framework argument to make a pitch that debates should be adjudicated on philosophical competition. And if the 1NC is an ideological impact term to the 1AC, deciding that debate by saying the words I voted AF on the permutation is just like completely deranged. But a lot of the time, that is how judges start their RFDs and cap debates, because people don't know how to answer the perm double bind. Other questions? Yeah.
Are there like videos that exist in like your case study for this like the Tide cybernetics thing on YouTube?
Good question. We went for it a bunch against Emory last year. I don't know if any of the Emory people have recordings. I try to get them to record, but they like never do. They're the worst. But the first semester they went for it a bunch. Second semester they went for it a bunch. Yeah, pretty much all year. If I don't know if there's a recording of the NDT doubles where Texas tweeted Emory PR, but that debate's pretty good. It's like a pretty good example of how to go for this, I think. There's also older videos of Texas DW. There's one from CETA, like CETA doubles or triples or something, where we're nag against a Michigan team going for the IRK. But it's definitely not nearly as well thought out as it is now. It's definitely gotten a little better since then, but it's still maybe helpful. I don't know. Okay. Well, we only have 15 minutes left. I had plans to do this for like 40. But we will make do with what we have. So this seems to be happy now. I think I'm sharing it on Zoom. Nope, not sharing it. It's sharing now though. Okay, so here are some cards. And I want us to go through and find framework offense in them. And these are basically just cards that I cut because I thought they were interesting. I didn't really, that's most of the time when I cut cards, it's just like I find a thing that seems interesting and then like figure out how to make a debate argument out of it. That's not necessarily the most efficient approach, but it's the approach I find most fun. Really, there's two. So there's two ways I cut cards for the game. One is I like reading about this thing. So I'm going to cut cards about it until I find a thing that sounds like it could be useful for debate. Or thing two is one of my debaters says, I want to give a 2NR that says the following, or I want to give a 2R that says the following, find cards for me that lets me say this. And so that's kind of how I approach critical research. I don't know if either of those are good, TBH, but that's just how I do it. All right, let's do read mode. Is this good? No, this is terrible. This is even worse. Okay, we'll just do draft. Fine. Okay, so here's a card about climate change. We need to find framework offense in it. Can I zoom in like this? Shrink what? Shrink what? This? Yeah, it did actually. All right, what do you think? Anything yet? I'm going to scroll down. Is that okay? Am I good to scroll? Okay. Is there a framework argument in this card? Yeah. What are some framework arguments in this card? Scroll up. Okay. Cool, cool, cool. Let me know when to stop scrolling. I'm going to go down. This part? Okay, what argument would you make from this? Remember, no buzzwords. You're banned. Jargon that debaters use as an enthematic shorthand for broader ideas. So like if I say internal link term, that's like jargon. Or if I say subject formation, or if I say, ontology, all these are jargony terms that I would refer to as buzzwords. So what would you say the framework argument that you think is in this section is? You could say anything in the card. Okay, so they like rely on a specific set of perspectives, and that sort of frames what they think counts as an argument and what doesn't count as an argument. Yeah, so I think that's true. So it's like kind of like the coherence is only thought of as being a product of rational choice and real experts, and it is just as important. The conversations we have at pipeline protests or family dinner tables are just as important. Yeah, Mishi, what do you think the framework argument is? Another one. Like very top?
Rather, we should focus on like the way that speech.
This stuff?
Yeah, and then the bottom part about how speech where affects those things in like non-linear ways that wouldn't be assumed by a fine focus.
Yeah, for sure. Sort of like the things that we say often don't have any relationship with how they're interpreted. This is kind of a classic framework argument, which is that the way that we understand meaning is very different than the way that others understand meaning. Has anyone ever had a conversation with a friend or family member that concluded with you saying, you just don't get it, or you just don't understand where I'm coming from? All the time, right? Yeah, because like communication is real tough. And the idea that we could rationally communicate based on spewing polysyllabic words at each other at 300 words per minute is kind of cartoonish. Yeah, okay. Any other like distinct framework argument you think there is in this card? Anyone else have an idea? Yeah.
Our decisions are formed within our subconscious based off of like multiple assumptions. So
Mhm.
we shouldn't do one thing to destroy one scenario. For instance, like analyzing the entire
This stuff or
no, I think it's more than
yeah, for sure. Yeah, so I think that when so this card just came from like this book that I found that I thought was cool. So I just like started reading it. And I made notes in the book for where like debate arguments came up, but I was just like, reading it for fun. So that's where this came from. Next thing. This one might be a little easier. Probably useful for this topic, actually.
Like in some framing argument that like when I guess the argument it's making is that like we always tend to omit scholarship that doesn't make like a very punchy claim that we can like always utilize and like go to war with. So like we should include the scholarship.
And notice how Arwen said go to war with, right? Did you mean like metaphorically, like
a card is like a weapon in my arsenal that I
I
can
guess
go to war
both,
with.
right? So like.
Yeah,
when, you know,
yeah.
they wanted, the war in Iraq, they used the scholarship to support the premise that the war that we want. They like
Mhm.
launched the war based off of this like one subset of scholarship that was extremely reactionary, extremely like rhetorically powerful. And
Right,
Yeah.
like this, right? Statements like this is good science and these results are robust are science without reference. Yeah, let's keep reading, see if we find more framework arguments. You could just stop me and tell me what is your framework argument and then explain it anytime you want. Anyone can do this.
I thought the like software has like a good term like offensive for arbitrariness. Because like the standards of research are reified through the process.
Yeah. And also the other thing is like you could highlight it differently, right? So like if you wanted that to be a big thing, you could highlight way more of it. Ooh, how about this? What's this art?
like we always focusing on Western liberal knowledge instead of like. all of the other-
Speak more broadly. What is Western liberal modes of knowledge? That sounds complicated. Talk to me like I'm your grandma. What would you tell her if you were explaining this to? I don't know if you have a grandma, but if you do, imagine she's sitting here and you're explaining it.
Right. I have to speak in Farsi, but you know, fair enough. No, I
Okay,
think
well, all
I
right.
guess the argument is like.
You get the point, I think, of the exercise. That is cool though.
Yeah, I think the argument here is that when we try to argue point in a format like debate, where most of the people that are debating are like from the very Eurocentric tradition
Mhm.
of like, I guess, I don't know what to call it, like maybe like empiricism or like these more Western, like I guess Renaissance modes of thought, like rationality and stuff like that. They kind of favor more Eurocentric performance rather than something that is like in the periphery, like I guess this part is about non-white, or like non-Western.
So it's like right there. Yeah.
Yeah. Like all of these are kind of excluded because they're
Right.
like policy minded.
They don't advance the canon. They don't advance the Western canon of scholarship forward. And so they're slowing it down and getting in the way. All of these people talking about how, women never get pubs in IR fields because they're considered incapable of real science. What a waste of time, right? That's sort of like a constant refrain in this vein of literature is the sort of problem of that. And then this too, like what is reviewers who note the exclusionary effect of the standards will often mourn and move on, seeing such lack of standards as more insidious than exclusionary effects. What does this sound like? How would you, in the debate sense, what does this seem like to you? This makes me think of one thing. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Like there's that. And then there's just like, yeah, it's sad that the theory of the world that the 1AC is endorsing is sexist. And, we'll make a note of that. I'll like acknowledge you had an impact to this MIRP, but I'm still voting on case outweighs. Like, come on here. Nuclear war, judge. Right. So it's a permutation. Well, I want to finish this and then you all can go. Just finish this card, then we can leave. Just stay with me a little longer. Because I think this is important because there's so many different ways to read this. Okay. What does this do?
Cool. That's like the TBA, right? That's like you should be able to make these arguments in a way that is like conducive to non-formal debate.
Yeah, to fit within the mold. It assumes that those excluded would be happy to change the form to fit within the mold. It's just framework. Yeah. What do we make out of this? Yeah. Yeah. What do you think? Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it says that the critique fails to maximize clash and then labels it as a failure. Right? Yeah. Ooh. What are we getting out of this?
The ion is like, okay, so like the Western structure characterizes certain like rhetoric, certain IRs like more successful than others. That IR tends to like fall into this mold of like empiricism, that like states are reactive, states like they make like very bold claims about states. I guess
What if we didn't think of this metaphorically? What if we interpreted this literally? Like in a very literal sense. The winners are by definition normatively superior. Categories of successful and failed provides a weapon to exclude and delegitimize the unsuccessful. What argument is this letting you make in a framework? Yeah, it's a reason why the ballot matters, right? Yeah. Yeah, so you don't always have to interpret things metaphorically. Sometimes you can interpret them literally. Yeah, so that's kind of the end here. Yeah, do one more.
sort of like I know that like that article is in context of like
Yes.
how does that not?
Because embracing the failure means to vote negative for the neg's failure to participate in the logics of white cis debate. So the neg says we agree. So like the neg says, yes, we have violated their model of debate. We have failed to participate in their model of debate. The judge endorses that failure by voting negative. Like, I don't think failure doesn't mean like taking the L. Like it's much more, it's an aesthetic experience in which you fail to adhere to society's traditional norms and standards. So queerness is failure because it is a failure to be cis heteronormative. And Halberstam's argument is that we should imagine what it would be like to embrace the failure that is inherent to queerness. And instead of saying we are not deviant, instead embrace and affirm that deviance and that failure as beautiful, which looks like voting neg for the neg's failure to be beholden to traditional debate practices or traditional practices in IR, not vote AF to exclude the neg. You know, like that'd be a weird interpretation of Halberstam, I think. Does that help?
Yeah. I was like,
Yeah, I mean, it's like the first line of response everyone says against Halberstam is like, haha, you say failure good, so that means you should lose the ballot. It's like, well, it's like, that's not really, it's like not really the argument. Yeah. Okay, well, I guess we don't have time for more. I had like a doc full of these. But the best way to get better at thinking about how you do framework from a literature perspective is just doing this. Just go through your link cards. Don't like try to cut framework cards. Instead, look at your links and read your link articles or read the books that your links are from. Or if you don't have time for books, read an article that cites the book and do this. Go through and ask yourself what things in this link argument can be a framework argument, because the people who tell you critiques should be link impact alt, get rid of this framework stuff. The reason they tell you that is because debaters think about framework not as being about the AF or about their arguments, but this separate external thing. And that's why framework debates are so bad and so awful to judge. But if you could be better about it and contextualize things to your literature base and contextualize your arguments to the 1AC, the AF will lose because they have not had any practice debating them. They'll lose again and again and again. because they will keep claiming you are being unfair, which is not responsive to your argument, which is just doing the link debating, but about the form of the 1AC rather than the content of the 1AC. No one is prepared to defend the form of their advocacy. They're almost always only prepared to defend their content, if that. Right. Thanks for hanging out with me. Well, yeah.